Well, it's my pleasure today to introduce Darwin Day. Darwin, as many of you know, Charles Darwin was a real inspiration to science, changed the way that we think about the world and science in many ways. And the celebration of Darwin Day is actually on February 12th. We're celebrating it today, and many people celebrate it throughout the month. Our first speaker today is Joseph Baker. And Dr. Baker is an ETSU faculty member in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And as you can see in his topic, Darwin, the Bible, and Public Response to Evolution from the Scopes Trial to the 21st Century, this really is a fantastic place to talk about the idea of evolution and education because of our history here in Tennessee. And so he's going to tell us all about that. We have a lot of events today, a lot of different talks, so I hope you're able to stick around for that. My name is Dr. Blaise Schubert. I'll be around, happy to talk with you all. Don't forget that at 11:30 we are having a lunchtime discussion as well. Hopefully Dr. Baker will be able to stay around and talk with us at that time. But to answer your questions, any questions that you might have, as best that we can. So with that, Joseph.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming out on a Saturday to listen to a lecture. Great, I really do appreciate that. This is going to be about sort of public response to evolution. So what I want to do first, just really quickly, is kind of give you my angle, where I'm coming from on this. So I'm sort of somewhere between anthropology, political science, and history. I'm kind of using these things, but I'm coming at it from a sociologist point of view. My training is in sociology of religion and criminology, which sort of explains my obsession with court cases here, which you'll see, and also kind of how I approach religion. So what I'm not going to do is, I'm not a physical scientist, right? So I'm not talking about fossils and those kinds of things. I'm talking about public response. And I'm talking about the relationship between the government and public education and those kinds of issues. So it's less about evolution per se and more about culture. So these are going to be the things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the boundaries of social institutions with particular emphasis on science, religion, and education, and how these things come together. So especially education sort of plays out on a local level, as we'll talk about. So these things kind of clash in some ways, and we'll kind of see where those fault lines are. I'm interested in this idea of dramatic narratives. So I'm going to talk about the Scopes Trial, which is high drama, among other things. But I'm also interested in how people construct narrative identity, so things like biblical literalism as an identity. So this is kind of the approach that I'll take. And what I'm going to do is look at court cases as evidence of sort of being along the fault lines of these institutions. So whenever you have a court case, it kind of tells you that there's something of a rift right there, and you can kind of look at it through that angle. And again, literalism as a social identity. Social identity. So this is where I'm coming from. And this will be sort of my approach to this. Okay, so I'll try to keep this brief. If there are any historians in the audience, I'm sure this will be too scant for you. But I've got to set up the background to Scopes before we really get into Scopes. So we'll talk about the diffusion of Darwin's idea of evolution. So in 1859, The Origin of Species is published. And in 1871, Descent of Man is published, where he actually makes explicit the links between humans and other animals. And this actually turns out to be the most contentious part of Darwin's ideas, is linking us to other animals. And that's the thing that becomes the most contentious. And his ideas are not accepted right away. There are many theories of evolution at this time. His is one of many. And the idea of a designer, that is a theistic designer, remains very prevalent. Now in the American South, here, there's resistance, but there's also diffusion into higher ed. So we tend to think of the South as being this place where evolution is not accepted, but for a while, it was making its way into higher education, especially colleges and universities. And I've got some more stories about this in a minute. This is also a period when people in the academy develop a more robust philosophy of secularism. The best book on this is Without God, Without Creed by James Turner, which talks about how academics, a lot of them are moving away from religion. And this actually, think about it this way, the academy as an institution moves them away from the public, because the public, the American public, is very religious. The academy is becoming less religious. So this is some of the rifts starting to show. So academics move toward greater skepticism and liberalism through positivism in the sciences and in the humanities through literary criticism. So these things are moving the academy sort of away from the public. So Darwinism comes to America. This is the easiest way to think about it. This is the cover of Ron Number's book, which is a history text on the diffusion of Darwinism. Okay, so the birth of modern fundamentalism. And I'll explain what I mean by this. So from 1890 to 1925, and 25 is when Scopes happened, so I'm kind of setting that up. This is an era of progressivism and the social gospel. That is, religion is very active as a social movement. If you think about things like suffrage, prohibition, lots of movements, social movements to actually change the way society operates from a religious angle. And American denominations are actually divided over biblical criticism and modernism. So I've got some great cartoons here in a minute. You'll see this idea of modernism is really prevalent. So between 1910 and 1915, some books are published called The Fundamentals, which are Protestants trying to affirm sort of supernatural fundamentals. And this is actually where we get the term religious fundamentalism. Before this, nobody has ever talked about religious fundamentalism in any sense. This is where we actually get the language of religious fundamentalism. Protestants in denominations that are having a theological rift, and they publish papers that are sort of trying to affirm a conservative view, right? A conservative view of supernaturalism in Scripture. And at the same time, during the same period, public education vastly expands. And why this is important is because the ability to dictate the curricula of a school becomes a political issue, right? So now we sort of have these things coalescing. And these are the fundamentals. So if you've ever seen this, it's a whole series of texts, and they're written by different authors, and they address different topics. So one will be on the virgin birth of Christ, one will be on the resurrection, they'll be on all these different topics in Protestant Christianity. But if we talk about now, sometimes we talk about Islamic fundamentalism, all kinds of fundamentalism. This is where the language comes from. It's from these texts. So this is the first time we get the idea of fundamentalism. All right, so brief interlude. I did my graduate work at Baylor University, which is the second largest Baptist school in the world after Liberty. Technically, Liberty counts as online students, so we could quibble. Maybe Baylor wins out in that. But so in the 1920s, there are people who teach evolution in private religious schools, Baylor being one of them. But as this sort of movement of anti-evolution rises, some academics are run out. One of them in 1920 is a Baylor sociologist. Now keep in mind, this is where I'm doing my doctoral work and I'm studying evolution. So as I'm sort of like finding this story, I'm very interested in it, as you might imagine. So technically what this is Grove Dow published a book that was an intro sociology book, but he used social Darwinism. He wasn't a hard scientist, he just used the idea of evolution. But this was still very offensive to a man named J. Frank Norris, who was popularly known as the Texas Tornado. J. Frank Norris was a fundamentalist minister in Dallas who had a very large congregation and wielded a lot of influence in the religious community. Norris, he hounds Dow for a good 2 years, trying to get him to resign and publishing things that saying that evolution has infiltrated venerant Baptist institutions. So, let's see, here we go. You wouldn't believe what I had to go through to get this. This is from 1923, and this is from the Searchlight, which was Norris's newsletter. At its height, it had a circulation of 60,000 readers. 60,000 readers. All right, now, the great thing about this is actually the building I was in when I was doing my research. I was in an addition, so I'm like right here doing this. I'm in like an addition to this building. So this is just one of many. This is just one I found particularly interesting. But he's using all these publicity tactics to try to make this controversial, and eventually he's successful and he runs Dow out. He tries to run out some biologists, but eventually they retire to kind of get away from it. So this is the sort of anti-evolution campaign really starts in earnest in about 1922. And so this is sort of the movement of that. And I have to point out my favorite part of this, an actual photograph. We've come a long way in the technology of photography. So the anti-evolution campaign really begins in 1922. And so what this is there are religious politicians who take on evolution as a cause. That is to say, they make anti-evolution their sort of crusade. And I should point this out. One of the most prominent member of this group is William Jennings Bryan, who I will tell you a lot about here in just a minute. But he is sort of the most prominent spokesman for anti-evolution. Now in 1925, Billy Sunday, who was probably the most popular evangelist of his day, preaches to revive an immense revival crowd in Tennessee. And among other things, he says, education today is chained to the devil's throne. Now these are so what I've got here are some cartoons. These are political cartoons from this era. So let me try to point out what's going on here. So this is a bridge to glory, as you'll see, and what is pulled out from this, all the solid foundations, is the cross, the virgin birth, atonement by blood, the deity of Christ, salvation by faith. And what replaces them are these tiny spindles of Bible written by man, education, salvation by works, natural birth, no hell, and evolution. So what they're doing is they're tying evolution to lots of other political issues. And this is important, and this is still the way it is today, but it's wrapped in with a larger political argument. Here's one that says, this says evolution and this is higher criticism. So again, if you think about it, hard science, humanities, and the hard scientist sign says denial of the supernatural in the world, and the higher criticism one says denial of supernatural in the Word. And this gentleman is trying to read his Bible and he says, stand out of my light. And here's one, this one's, what this says is science falsely so called. Opening the jar of Darwinism and the genie is coming out. It is the spirit of lawlessness, and his stick says might makes right. All right, so, and this is actually Brian's argument, is that what evolution does is it creates a might makes right morality. And he actually blames the theory of evolution for sort of aggressive tendencies of certain countries of World War I. This one I like just because it has an octopus. But you'll notice here's modernism again, the term modernism. And so modernism has its tentacles around Sunday school, the YMCA, the seminary, the church, the religious press, and the college. And so the idea is that this general modernism is sort of infiltrating all these different institutions. So this is like, to understand where anti-evolution comes from, this gives us a quick sort of insight into that. All right, so Tennessee passes a law. So William Jennings Bryan spearheads this, and he is successful to get the Tennessee legislature to pass a law against teaching evolution in public schools. And this is what the law reads. It shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, or other public schools of the state, which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. So again, you see this connecting humans to other animals. But this actually becomes important in the trial. This denies the divine story of creation, because lawyers to the ACLU will actually make the case that religion and science are compatible, and we don't have to deny divine creation in order to teach evolution. So the language of the law becomes sort of part of the drama. The trial of the century. Here we go. All right, so 1925. The ACLU is brand new, and the ACLU has never won a court case. And in fact, they're having such a hard time with litigation that they decide that it would actually be more effective to go with publicity than to litigation. So they actually intentionally tried to make the trial a publicity event. So they target this new Tennessee law, and they decide that this is going to be one of the ways they're going to raise awareness of their cause and civil liberties. So they take out an ad that is looking for a willing patsy. As they take out an ad that says, we are looking for a teacher who would be willing to test the constitutionality of this law that Tennessee has passed, and we will provide you with full support from the ACLU. That is, we'll give you the lawyers, we'll pay all the costs. Right? Well, basically, all we need is somebody to play the role, and that's what they're asking for. Now, a Dayton coal plant manager named George Rapelier sees the ad. So he sees this ad and decides that they can actually turn this into something, that Dayton, the town, can benefit from this. So he takes this ad to a meeting of the town fathers in the local drugstore, and they hatch a plan, basically, to find a patsy and stage the trial in Dayton. That is, Dayton will become sort of a tourist destination. All right, so here are your major players in the drama. The ACLU have talked about John Scopes. This is Scopes, and this is a picture of him at the time of the trial. At the time of the trial, he's 24 years old. He's only been a high school teacher for 1 year. He is not a science teacher. He's an athletics coach. And the only reason it's even possible that he violated the law is because he once subbed in a biology class where they were doing a review for a test. And so it's actually somewhat debatable whether or not he broke this law, but he says he's willing to do it, and they literally fetch him from off the tennis court to tell him this. And he agrees to be the patsy. The town of Dayton, I was talking about, they're kind of looking to benefit from this, so they're a major player in this. And I love this. This is a picture from the main street, and you can say, this is the drugstore. It all started here, which is like anybody who's coming for tourism, here's the place to go. This is townspeople waiting on the arrival of William Jennings Bryan, who is, and again, I'll talk about him here in just a second. He's something of a populist hero. But these are people awaiting his arrival. And then I love this. This is the owner of the drugstore shooting some promos. And I'm not sure who the woman is, but she looks about as thrilled. Especially this one where she's watching this monkey play piano. So again, the town is trying to profit on this, right? They're trying to use this to drum up some publicity and get people to come to their town, and he's trying to get people to come to his drugstore. All right, H.L. Mencken becomes another player in this. So H.L. Mencken is a famous newspaper writer, satirist, also a famous religious skeptic. And this is Mencken. He writes for a Baltimore newspaper, and he becomes probably the most famous voice covering the trial. And he's actually involved in sort of getting some of the wheels turning to get it to happen as well. Now, the media is critical in this, right? So this trial occurs right at the advent of mass radio, right at the point where people can actually have access to news radio. So here's a picture of the trial, and you can ignore the men. This is the thing that matters. The microphone. The trial is being beamed out live on radio. And this is one of the first things to ever be beamed out live on radio like this. And so it becomes something where everybody can sort of partake of it vicariously. It has wide impact because of the media. And then, of course, the public. So people flock to this to see it. And I've got some stuff on this later, but basically every newspaper in the country covers this because people want to know how it turns out. All right, so here are your sort of the people who are involved in the most intense part of this brawl. We have the Great Commoner versus Old Necessity. These are their nicknames. The Great Commoner is William Jennings Bryan, who is a populist and a 3-time nominee for the presidency of the United States. And I'm not talking like he ran 3 times. He won the Democratic nomination 3 times. Lost every time. But he was a very famous politician. He was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. Resigned as the U.S. moved into World War I because he took an isolationist stance. Old Necessity, which comes from this phrase, necessity knows no law, is Clarence Darrow, who is the most famous criminal defense attorney in the U.S. at this time. In fact, he's fresh off the Leopold and Loeb case, where he defended 2 young men who murdered somebody just because to see if they could get away with it. And what he did was he had them basically plead guilty and then argued in front of the judge that capital punishment was wrong. And because it showed that the penal system was about retribution and not rehabilitation. And he got them life sentences instead of death. And so before this, that was the trial of the century. In other words, if you want the trial of the century, you better get Darrow. Now, who Darrow is he is wily. He is wily, shrewd, and probably he is an ardent religious skeptic. An ardent religious skeptic. And his background sort of sets him up for that. His father was the same way. So here's quotes from the men going into the battle. WJB, the contest between evolution and Christianity is a duel to the death. Darrow, Scopes isn't on trial, civilization is on trial. Now, the angle they take on this is that William Jennings Bryan is a populist. So he says, if the people of Tennessee don't want evolution taught, that's their right to say that. Darrow says it's an infringement on academic freedom, and people should be able to say whatever they want. So these are kind of the strategies. They're sort of setting themselves up here. Here is William Jennings Bryan's campaign poster from 1900, his second run for president. There's a lot of things going on here. But especially, again, I don't know why there's so many octopi in my presentation. This is supposed to be like the tyranny of the railroads, like the monopoly of railroads. And you see up here, no crown of thorns, no cross of gold. His most famous speech was about labor, and he said, "You will not force this crown of thorns on labor, and you will not crucify man on a cross of gold," because he was against the gold standard. So this is actually one of the most famous speeches in political history, so he uses it throughout his career. And at some point, he actually goes around and continues giving this talk over and over to make money. Here's the two men at the trial. So they're both getting up there in age. All right, so that's Bryan on the right, Darrow on the left. All right, drama. Okay, so the trial is a circus atmosphere, and it's meant to be. It's meant to be a publicity stunt, so it has a circus feel. And Scopes' guilt is not really in doubt, but it probably should have been, because it's not clear if he actually broke the law. But even the defense wants him found guilty because they want to appeal it to they want to get to the Supreme Court and challenge this law constitutionally. So they want him to be found guilty. So nobody's even really going to try to find him innocent. So what are we doing? Theater. We're doing theater. So this is the trial itself, which is packed out. You can see this is the courthouse in Dayton. This is Darrow addressing the jury. And it's packed. Every day is just packed with spectators. And so many people come to see it that they have to build benches outside. And they put speakers up so that people can hear the trial going on live and sit on the courthouse lawn. This actually becomes the scene of sort of the grand climax later, but no one knows that yet. So now they're just sitting outside. There's a read your Bible sign, which later Darrow will make them take down because, anyway, we'll talk about Darrow and his strategy. So Darrow objects to everything religious throughout the whole trial. They open the day with prayer, he objects, right? Church-state separation. So everything that's religious, he tries to sort of take shots at. Now the ACLU, with its other lawyers, is just trying to argue that religion and science are compatible. Darrow has a religious axe to grind. And for a while, it looks like he's not really going to be successful because the judge is very much in favor of Bryan and the prosecution. And in fact, the most memorable speech from the defense at one point, or actually I guess this is true of any speech at all, comes from Dudley Field Malone, not Darrow. And Malone counters an hour-long diatribe by Bryan, saying that we're here for religious freedom and religion and science are compatible. But that is sort of the most famous speech is from Malone and not Darrow. Now the interesting thing is that the judge, so what Darrow has done is he's called famous scientists down from all over the country to come and testify about evolution. But the judge will not allow him to enter that as evidence because he says that it's about whether or not Scopes broke the law. We're not here to try evolution. We're here to try whether or not Scopes taught it. So Darrow has them write up statements and submits it to the press. And so that he gets their message out anyway, but they're not allowed to testify. And he also holds Darrow in contempt of court. The exchange between the judge and Darrow is frankly hilarious through the entire proceedings. But Darrow shoots off at the mouth one too many times and gets held in contempt of court. And this is all leading up throughout the week until Friday. And it basically looks like there's going to be no good outcome for the defense at all. And here's how, this is during the trial, how people are portrayed. So this is a Memphis newspaper. This is Darrow, who they're calling the Antichrist. And this is, I guess, the frog of agnosticism. And over here we have spiritual despair. And then this is how Bryan is portrayed. Hills of hope, onward Christian soldiers such as you never know. Okay, so this is what H.L. Mencken says about the trial on Friday. There may be some legal jousting on Monday and some gaudy oratory on Tuesday, but the main battle is over with Genesis completely triumphant. So this is H. L. Menken's summation going into the week. But Darrow is ever wily. This is, if he is anything, he is wily. So he has what I would like to call Perry Mason moments, which is he finds a way to get what he's after. And this is how it gets moved to the lawn. The courthouse is so packed on Monday that the judge is worried about them breaking the ceiling in the courthouse, so he moves the proceedings onto the lawn. They literally go out on the lawn to finish this sort of trial. And so what Darrow does is he calls Brian, like a prosecutor, as an expert on the Bible. Says, you won't let me have experts on evolution? I'll call an expert on the Bible, and you are a self-professed expert. Here we go. Right, so now everybody says, don't do it. Even the judge tries to stop him, other prosecutors try to stop him, but Brian is too proud. And what Brian says is, I will answer any man's question about the Bible, anytime, anywhere. If this agnostic wants to question me, let him do it. So he agrees to take the stand, and truthfully, Darrow has been baiting him the entire trial and before the trial in the press. So he's a long time coming on this. So he's going for the big fish. And so what we get is Darrow grilling Brian on biblical literalism on the lawn for 2 hours. And this is among the things that were asked, just to give you a sense of this. So I call this, he's playing the village skeptic. These are some of the questions he asks during this. I like this one. Did snakes walk before being condemned to slip? So he basically is taking all kinds of things from the Bible and just sort of, and he's treating Brian like a hostile witness. He's just peppering him with these. So as soon as he answers, he comes with a follow-up, and it just is like rapid fire. So here's a quick excerpt to give you a sense of what this actually looks like. Darrow, do you think the sun was made on the 4th day? Brian, yes. And they had evening and morning without the sun? I'm simply saying it is a period. Darrow, they had evening and morning for 4 periods without the sun, do you think? Right, so I mean, it's literally like this. All these questions have this sort of repartee to them, and he's really just kind of trying to make him look foolish. So here's a picture of it. This is Darrow standing, Brian seated, and this is really what it looks like through most of the whole thing, is Darrow sitting there taking questions, and Brian taking the questions, and Darrow on the attack. Here's a view from overhead. I love this pose of him with his leg up on the chair there, sort of just peppering. And this is the view from the peanut gallery. So this is sort of the view from the average spectator. So, and literally after 2 hours, the judge calls this off like a ref in a prize fight. Like he just sort of stops the proceedings and says, we'll come back tomorrow. Like we've had enough. And Brian, he tried to do this multiple times and Brian would not let him. Brian just said, I'm going to stay here and answer any question he's got. So the judge kind of calls it off. Now, so that's the thing that is the most known from Scope's trial. That becomes the most famous scene. Now the results of the law, the case, the actual results, they're, again, always wily. He found out that Brian had prepared a speech, like an hour-long speech as his closing argument, in which he was going to sort of make his case for his position on religion. So Darrow abdicates giving closing arguments so that Brian cannot either. So he says, I'm not going to make a closing argument. I only asked that the jury find my client guilty. That's it. Right? And this is, so that's his move. But he takes away the platform. So he takes away Brian's platform. So Scopes is fined $100. And this is set by the judge, which becomes important. The judge makes, and this is the minimum he could be fined. Both sides claim victory because the prosecution claims legal victory. The defense claims basically that they have shown how foolish some of these ideas are. And ultimately, the Tennessee Supreme Court makes a tricky move. They uphold the ruling and throw out the case. So they uphold the law and say that the law is still intact, but we're going to throw out the case because it was the jury who was supposed to set the fine, not the judge. And so technicality, case gone. Basically, Tennessee is tired of being embarrassed, and the Supreme Court says, we're not going to let you get this to the United States Supreme Court, so we're going to do away with it. So they get rid of it, and this is the important part. zero legal impact. There is no effect to any of these laws. The law stands. Later lawyers will still use this argument, so it had some legal impact in that sense, but no actual legal ramifications for this trial. All theater. But we still know about it, right? So this is H.L. Mencken's account of the trial, his summation. The Scopes trial, from the start, has been carried on in a manner exactly fitted to the anti-evolution law and the simian imbecility under it. There hasn't been the slightest pretense of decorum. Let no one mistake it for comedy, farcical though it may be in all its details. It serves notice on the country that Neanderthal man, that should be is organizing in these forlorn backwaters of the land, led by a fanatic, rid of sense and devoid of conscience. So, enjoy, this is how the South is being portrayed, right? So, and this is how it's portrayed in northern newspapers. So this is from the Chicago Trib. You can see this is Tennessee, and there ain't no such things. Shooting at evolution here. And then this is Brian, this is from the New York World, lambasting over men doing science. All right, so this is how it's portrayed in the North. Now here's a perspective I really care about. Howard Odom is a sociologist, so I'm willing to listen, right? I have institutional obligation to listen. But he's a famous sociologist from the University of North Carolina, and this is how he sums up the trial. And he actually hits the nail on the head, right? He figures out what's going to go on with this. What I found to date was more pathos than joke, more futility than fighting, more tragedy than comedy, more inexperience and ignorance, including visiting seekers after truth, or sensation than lack of intelligence. And, this is the part that matters most, he actually did a quantitative study and found that the trial was covered by 2,300 daily newspapers, 13,000 weekly newspapers, 3,600 monthly newspapers, and 892 other publications. And his quote on this is that, I found no periodical of any sort, including agricultural magazines, that did not cover the trial. It was covered by everything. So media is the thing that matters. So it's not legal, it's media. All right, so who gets the last word? So Brian is forced to stump his speech. By the way, Brian actually invented stumping for president. Like, he's the first one who really went across the country and gave speeches and speeches and speeches in 1896. So he is a famous orator, and he says, I'll take this on the road. And he goes to places around Tennessee and stumps his speech. But 5 days after it, he dies while in his sleep. So 5 days after, on this day, he had literally gone to Chattanooga, delivered his speech, went back to Dayton, and died in the afternoon while taking a nap. So Brian, in some sense, becomes a martyr of this. And it's seen as though this is sort of his last stand. And this is them loading his casket. This is in Dayton. They're loading his casket to take it to sit in state in the Capitol because of his political history. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So, in some sense, right after the trial, the last word is had by Brian. He's seen as a populist hero who died for the cause. So, here's what happens out of this. Evolution is downplayed in text. It's actually removed from textbooks, usually because textbooks sellers want to make money, and if it's controversial, they don't want to put it in there. So they see that this is going to be a big issue, and it's removed from high school texts. And there's a smattering of state and local statutes. So Tennessee's law stands. Arkansas passes a law in 1928. Let's see, what's the one I'm forgetting? Oklahoma and Florida have some. Oh, Mississippi has a law. So there are 3 states that really outlaw teaching evolution, and those stand, and it gets removed from textbooks. And Protestant fundamentalism sort of retreats from the public stage here. That is, there aren't big social gospel causes that are taken up for a while because, Amy's in here, she says, when the economy is bad, moral politics issues get put on the back burner because people care about whether or not they can eat. Right? So, but what happens is Protestants begin building a subcultural infrastructure. Case in point, Bryan College is founded in the town of Dayton, William Jennings Bryan's honor. So it's like they sort of build their own educational infrastructure. So there's relative calm. There's no more court cases or anything about this. And then in the late 40s, there's a big change that happens, which is that Supreme Court trials actually apply the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That is that the government shall make no establishment of religion. They apply it to the state level. Instead, it was only at federal level until this. But this actually sort of grafts the First Amendment to the 14th Amendment and says that establishment is an issue at the state level and not just the federal level. So what this does is it opens the door for somebody to challenge evolution again, right? Or to challenge the banning of evolution. So in between, in the 50s, we get Inherit the Wind. Anybody else seen this one? I actually only just watched this recently, right? So I hadn't seen this until recently. But Inherit the Wind is about the Scopes trial, and it begins as a Broadway play in the 50s. It's supposed to be a commentary on McCarthyism, right? So it's supposed to be sort of about the McCarthy era more than it is about Scopes. But this is how people now know Scopes. If you probably know about Scopes, it's probably through this lens. In 1960, there's a TV movie version. I'm sorry, in 1960 there is a movie version, in 65 a made-for-TV movie version, and it's remade for the big screen in 88, 99. So the trial is such high drama that you can't help but use it in that fashion, essentially. So this is how people tend to know about the trial now. It becomes the lens that defines Scopes. And what's portrayed in it is more the combat between Darrow and Bryan than all the rest of the hoopla. That becomes the focus. All right, so 1961, I'm just moving chronologically. There's the publishing of a book called The Genesis Flood. So this is by Henry Morris, who was an engineering professor at Virginia Tech. And this breathes new life into young Earth creationism by doing this. So prior to this, creationism didn't really have a way to make an argument for being scientific creationism. This is the start of scientific creationism as sort of a strategy. This is the book. I think it has been through, last I checked, it was like 42 pressings. This thing still sells quite well. It's still really popular. You can find it in a local religious bookstore, I'm sure. And he founds what becomes the Institute for Creation Research, which is the main media hub for creationist material, the ICR. And I had a video from it that we could watch, but the sound isn't working, so you'll just have to take my word for it, that there's a lot of science rhetoric in it. It's about science, like it's using the language of science. And if nothing else, that tells you sort of a shift in the balance of power, that the creationist movement is now using science rhetoric, and that shows you that how sort of institutionalized science has become. There's my link. Scientific creationism is what it's about, though. So this rhetoric sets the stage for what will come after this next court case. Oh, I forgot. Okay, so here's an example. These are young Earth creationists here. This is in Glen Rose, Texas. So there's a fossil site there, much like this one. It's a state park. And right at the outskirts of the park, they set up a young Earth creation museum to counter the message that occurs inside the park. So this thing is like, this is actually built like an ark. And they have educational videos that they run in here. Here I am watching one of them up here doing my due diligence. So I'm watching the video, and you can see behind it, this is the 6 days of creation. So what they're trying to do is shrink the timeline down to keep it young Earth, that is under 10,000 years old. So this is young Earth creation. And so this is a poster that was available there, which is basically they're trying to put dinosaurs, humans, and animals all together with the ark to keep the time span short on the age of the Earth. So this is young Earth creation. All right, back to the court. So in the 60s, evolution comes back to textbooks. It comes back, and this is based on a federal commission that basically says you have to put evolution in there because it's a central part of science now. You have to put it in. So in 1965, Little Rock schools adopt a textbook that has evolution in it. Keep in mind that Arkansas still has a law that says you can't teach evolution. So basically your teachers are now put in a position where you have to use the textbook that you adopted, but it's against the law. Right? So what do? So they actually find somebody who's willing to test the law. Again, Susan Epperson is a young biology teacher, and she says that she is willing to test its constitutionality. Here she is reading the textbook that they had. She's very young at the time, and they picked her for specific reasons. She was born and raised in Arkansas, educated in Arkansas, and she knew she was leaving Arkansas soon. Basically, she was able to say that I'm a hometown person, but then if there's any fallout, I don't have to stay. Her husband was in the Air Force, and they knew they were going to move to Colorado Springs where there was a large Air Force base. And so she felt like she was perfect for this, right? That she could sort of claim to be local, but at the same time not have to deal with anything that was a fallout. Now Tennessee, as this begins working, so it starts in 65, working its way through the courts, and is almost made it to the Supreme Court by 67. And Tennessee sees the writing on the wall, and the legislature repeals the law that Scopes tested. And then in 1968, the Supreme Court finds the Arkansas law unconstitutional, using new interpretations of the Establishment Clause to say, if we apply the Establishment Clause at the state level, if you're using creationism, you're promoting religion. All right, so this is the argument that they use. All right. So in response, what happens now is that, okay, so evolution is now allowed. So the creationist movement now moves to, okay, if you're going to teach evolution, you have to teach creation as well. Just have balanced treatment, right? And so they actually use this new interpretation to say, if the state's going to be neutral on religion, it's got to present Darwinism and creationism, because that's neutrality, it's balance. So they actually take the new interpretation and try to use it. So in 1981, Louisiana passes, and this is what the law is called, the Balanced Treatment for Creation Science and Evolution Science Act. And again, this works its way through the courts, and the Supreme Court finds the act unconstitutional in 1987. And again, the finding, what the Supreme Court decision says, is essentially that creation science is still religion instead of science. It's still religion. So, and that means it violates the Establishment Clause. All right, now we move to the phase that we're in now, the phase of kind of how this operates. We're now in the intelligent design phase. So after 3 decades of losing court battles, the creationist movement moves to transitioning into promoting intelligent design. And if I can, my best summation of intelligent design is that it's trying to cast doubt on evolution, and anywhere there's a gap in evolution, it fills that gap with sort of a creator. And that's the way it operates. It's a philosophical argument that's about casting doubt. And that's kind of how it operates. And the people who are the main proponents of this are lawyers and philosophers. And so it's rhetorical. It's a rhetorical thing. All right, so back to Waco, Texas for a minute. So now I told you in 1920 that they ran out evolutionists. To show you how far the field has shifted in favor of evolution, in 2000, as I call it, the Dow Row, after the Dow Row, then president of Baylor, Robert Sloan, is trying to push the school as being the vanguard of both keeping its religious faith and being a scientific enterprise. And what he does is, without alerting any of the other faculty members, he brings in Bill Dembski, who is one of the main philosophical voices of ID, and he creates the Michael Polanyi Center for him, which is basically, this is named after a philosopher of science. And so it's supposed to be sort of the hub of intelligent design research. The faculty won't have it because they say it will make them look bad. You will kill our funding, you will kill our reputations. People cannot know that I am an evolutionary biologist at a place where ID is sort of the main thing. So the faculty senate sort of responds and votes 26-2 to dissolve the center. So again, we move from running evolutionists out to actually running intelligent design people out. So this gives you a sense of the institutional change, the shift. Sloan rejects the vote and says he's going to call for outside inquiry. He wants a neutral observer. And the neutral panel says, well, there's nothing wrong with having it, but it needs to be in the religion department. Right? Again, sort of saying religion, not science. So he essentially said the panel finds you can keep it, but it should be in religion or philosophy. This is Bill Dembski's press statement that comes out the day after the panel finds this. The report marks a triumph of intelligent design as a legitimate form of academic inquiry. This is a great day for academic freedom. I'm deeply grateful to President Sloan and Baylor University for making this possible, as well as to the peer review committee for its unqualified affirmation of my own work on intelligent design. The scope of the center will be expanded to embrace a broader set of conceptual issues at the intersection of science and religion, and the center will therefore receive a new name to reflect this expanded vision. My work on intelligent design will continue unabated. Dogmatic opponents of design who demanded the center be shut down have met their Waterloo. He's removed as director the following week. And Sloan actually tries to stop him from doing this. He says, don't be combative. Like, we're going to let you keep it in religion. Don't be combative. And he tells him not to do it, and he does it. So they remove him the next day. Now, the great thing about this for him is that they have to keep him on staff for like 4 years because he signed a contract. He never taught a class at the university, but was paid. It's a good hustle, you can find. All right, so now to an intelligent design case. So in 2004, a Pennsylvania school district requires teaching intelligent design as an alternative to evolution. Again, so moved from creation science as balanced treatment to ID as balanced treatment. And they say we're going to adopt the text of Pandas and People, which becomes important. So this is the text in its second edition. All right, so a group of parents bring suit with the ACLU support. In all these cases, the ACLU is in support of people bringing suit against it. This is evidence that was used at the trial. All right, so this was presented by a philosopher named Barbara Forrest. And what this is these are editions of the book, which became Of Pandas and People and started as creation biology. But so what she shows is essentially that she runs a word search for the word creationist or creationism. How many times is it used in the text? What about the phrase intelligent design? How many times is it used in the text? And what she shows is that it's creationism all the way until 87 when you get the Aguillard case. And as soon as that case comes down, we go right to ID, and they literally do a search and replace of ID for creationism. And so what this sort of shows, and this is the way they make the argument that it's just creationism in new form. Creationism has evolved. Right? This is the actual argument that they make. So, and a conservative, the judge who's deciding this case is a conservative appointed by George W. Bush. And he finds that, again, creationism, that ID is religion. He says that the board had religious interests in mind when they made it. They used a religious text. It's still religion. So again, he uses these interpretations of the establishment clause and says ID violates it as well. All right, so now so I've given you this historical narrative. Institutional shifts in favor of evolution are apparent in science, law, and education, but what about the public? All right, so institutional shifts in favor of evolution, but what about public acceptance of evolution? So this is something that gives you a sense of the range of positions on evolution and creationism. I actually thought there was nobody left with geocentrism, but I got a mailing the other day about geocentrism, so it's still around, but just barely. Young Earth creationism, gap creationism. Interestingly enough, day-age creationism is what Brian espoused at the Scopes trial. People think of him as a hardline fundamentalist, but he said the days in Genesis could be long eras. I have no idea. Progressive creationism kind of says that God creates animals in spurts at different times, and so he created the dinosaurs at one time and then other animals later. And we move down here all the way to strict sort of materialist evolution. This would be like Dawkins, Richard Dawkins. Agnostic evolution. These say essentially evolution is true, but God is guiding it. And it just depends on where you put the emphasis. This one says it's more about evolution, and this one says it's more about God. So there's a wide range. People usually take moderate positions on this. All right, now, this is a global survey. So this was just a yes or no. Is evolution, are humans descended from other animals, yes or no? Here we are. These are Western countries. So we're basically second to last. We're just above Turkey, and Turkey kind of is that east-west border, and they were added in here. This is an article from the journal Science, but basically shows that acceptance of evolution is not very prevalent, right? Among the public, it's not prevalent, in spite of institutional shifts in its favor. So here's some trends from the last 20 years. We only have good data from the last 20 years or so. This is some Gallup polling. So the top line is God created humans in their present form, so kind of a creationist position. And you see really no big change. It's right about 45%. So this is from 82 to 2012. And they're asking the same question. Basically, do you think that God created humans in the present form? Or the next one, evolution guided by God. There's a slight drop off in that, but it's pretty stable too. Evolution not guided by God, slight uptick. This is reflecting that now there are more seculars in the U.S., which I could talk about if you want me to geek out on the U.S. stat-wise. And then this is don't know. So there are a few, but really it's spaces. There's no real change. It's about the same. And if you force people and so this is, again, honestly, I'm a bit of a data wonk, as they would say. If you ask the question in such a way that you force people to pick one, more people pick creationism. That is, they'll pick creationism instead of evolution. So here's some patterns of it. So I'll try to make sure I'm clear about this. These questions are about, one question says, humans are descended from other animals over millions of years. So it kind of asks people to take the strongest stance on evolution. Do you agree or disagree? The other one says, do you support teaching creationism in public schools? It's a policy question. All right, so the strongest predictors of this is view of the Bible. View of the Bible is the thing that matters most. In sociology of religion, we call this literalism. You ask people, which one of these best fits your view of the Bible? This one says, it should be taken literally word for word on all subjects. This one says, the Bible is divinely inspired, but we must interpret its meaning, which essentially says we affirm its sacred status, but we interpret it to the age in which you live. This one says, the Bible contains some truth, but also contains human error. It's kind of a midpoint. And this one sort of disavows its sacred status and says, it's an ancient book of history and legends. So, of course, this is the one this is acceptance of evolution, right? So it's all about view of the Bible. So the way to read this, 11% of literalists accept evolution, 84% of history and legends people accept evolution. So this is the main thing on which this sort of turns. Now, support for teaching creationism in public schools, right, goes the opposite direction. So this is the most central variable, as we would say, is about what's your view of the Bible. Other things that matter, political self-identification, and this is unique to the U.S. In other countries, evolution is not as politicized an issue as it is in the U.S. Here it's a politicized issue. So if you ask people, do you think of yourself as conservative or liberal? Here's what we get on this. So this runs from, I think of myself as very conservative, moderate in the middle, or very liberal. So this is acceptance of evolution. Liberals are about 7 out of 10, and the very conservatives are at 8%. So again, political identity sort of playing, and this one goes the opposite direction. So if you think of these ranked in order of their importance for predicting this, view of the Bible, political identity. Attendance at religious service also matters. Evangelical Protestant affiliation. I'm going to use Pew data for a minute. This is what is your religious affiliation versus the percent in each group that accept evolution. So 80% of Buddhists, 80% of Hindus, about 80% of Jewish respondents, 70% of people who say I have no religion. And the real resistance remains evangelical Protestantism, Mormonism, and Jehovah's Witnesses. So this is just kind of a sense. The reason I use Pew data here is because they have more of these questions. All right, now finally, this is what my real interest in this was. Does education matter? So like if you are a college grad, does that matter? If you only have a high school degree, does that matter? And if you just look at it on the face of it, so here's less than high school diploma, some college or vocational degree, or a college grad. College is the thing that makes people more likely to accept it. The other levels of education don't matter, and a lot of this is because, as we were discussing before, in a lot of high schools, because high school is a local level thing, teachers don't teach it. I mean, if I'm an instructor in Johnson County, I'm probably not going to do it, because do I want to go to PTA after that? No, I don't. So, I mean, I'm probably just going to skip it. I mean, and which is what happened in my high school, and when I talk about this, students say the same thing. It's totally understandable. And creationism, interestingly, has more support at mid-levels of education. And a lot of this is that people with less than high school will actually say on these questions, they're more likely to say, I don't know. I don't know. But, so I wanted to try to unpack what's going on with education. So here's what I did. When we hear about, and we're doing this today, response to low acceptance of evolution, the response is to say, we need more education, better education. But I was actually making the argument that what your view of religion is may dictate how education has an impact, if it has an impact at all. So, because education plays out on a local level and creationism is subcultural, I may be able to get a college degree moving through the evangelical sort of college system and never even encounter evolution. In fact, I may encounter support for creationism. So, education education in the US is so heterogeneous, it's so diverse, that I might choose a path that never really exposes me to it. So type of schooling and information seeking and internalization are key. Do kids seek this out? Do they choose schools that will, at college level, do they go to schools where it will be taught? Or do they sit in classes about evolution and not absorb the information? And we know that kids with strong conservative religious identity tend not to absorb certain pieces of information about evolution. So this is from, I've got a whole bunch of creationist texts up here if you want to check them out later. This is a good summation of my view on this, which is that if you're looking through a particular lens, you'll be taking in different information about the world, right? So the lens of literalism is different from the lens that is non-literalistic. And again, I'm using the creationist text to make my point, essentially. So this is also in there. This is in the same text. This is from Henry Morris's son, who's now the head of ICR. And so again, it's being tied into all these other political issues. The argument is that evolution is related to all these other political issues that religious conservatives care about. And so it's part of a larger constellation of belief. This is in the new one. This one's not in mine. I wish it was. I got to get a new edition. But anyway, the argument is that it goes along with all these sort of forms of sexual immorality. And I have to throw this in there because it's a dragon. But this is in the one. This is in my text up here if you want to check it out. All right. So here's what I did. Now back to my data wonking. What I did is I controlled for all these other variables that matter in terms of predicting evolution. And I looked to see if education had a different effect for literalists versus interpretationists versus people who sort of disavow. Right? So I'm going to let education have a different effect for each of these things and look at the patterns we get. So this is acceptance of evolution. So we start with history and legends crowd. Positive. Right? So if you're a history and legends person, the more you go to school, the more you accept evolution. If you're a human error group, college degree is the thing that matters. College degree. If you're an interpretationist, which most people fall into interpretation, they're about a quarter of the US population is literalist by this measure, about a quarter. So interpretationists, there's still a positive influence, but it's still fairly low overall, right? So if I'm a college-educated interpretationist, I'm about 1 in 3 to accept evolution. And here's the kicker, if you're a literalist, negative. So not only am I not accepting evolution, I'm probably picking up evidence or sort of learning things against it, right? So the more I go to school, I'm sort of learning evidence against it, so it's negative. We only figure this out by sort of sussing these very finely. Same thing, support for teaching creationism. All right, so history and legends crew, college grad makes you less likely, but that's the only thing. Human error, some slight negative, and then it sort of flattens out. It's a high school grad, so this one is very, very high at the beginning. The interpretation group is actually positive, so as interpretationists go to school more, they support creationism more. And literalists, strong positive, right? So again, the effect of education is in some sense contingent on your religious identity. This is my argument, is that religious identity sort of makes a difference for how education makes a difference, if it makes a difference. Okay, so now I'm going to counter all this culture wars talk and say that most people actually think religion and science are compatible. That is, about 15% of the US says religion and science are incompatible. Most people find a way to mix them, and they're okay with having them coexist side by side. Of this 15%, half are literalists and half are atheists and agnostics. So like 8% of Americans who are non-believers say they're incompatible, science wins, and another 8% say they're incompatible, the Bible wins. But those are the groups where you sort of have this conflict between religion and science. But they shout the loudest. So it's Bill O'Reilly arguing against the guy from the Atheist Union. Right? That's what you, instead of like a liberal theologian or something, right? It's something where you have those two sides, because that's drama, right? That's drama. So evolution is uniquely contentious because of its role as a signifier of religious and political identity, because it is tied to all these other things, because it's in a constellation of political views. That's what makes it so contentious. And again, people may accept limited versions of evolutionism and maintain a form of creationism. On that question, 10% of Americans said they accept evolution and support teaching creationism in public schools. So people will mix it in ways you might not expect. And so my claim is that these will continue to be contentious because they are bound up in other sort of issues of cultural and political conflict. Now I promise I will bring this back around. So the ghosts of scopes. Last April, Tennessee passed a quote-unquote Teach the Controversy Academic Freedom Bill. Anybody see this one? All right, so this is just recently, and here is the text. And I've highlighted the word scientific because, again, I'm interested in the use of the rhetoric of science. The teaching of some scientific subjects, including but not limited to biological evolution, chemical origins of life, global warming, human cloning, can cause controversy. Teachers shall be permitted to help students understand, analyze, critique, and review in an objective manner the scientific weaknesses and scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses of existing scientific theories covered in the course being taught. So a lot of science. There's a lot of science in there, but it's a very similar type of bill to previous creation science bills. So this passed the Tennessee House and Senate by a 3-to-1 margin. And Haslam didn't sign it into law because he knew it was going to be controversial. He let it go into law without his signature, by sort of copping out. All right, so that is the end of my chat. And I'll end with a quote from Clarence Darrow. I'd love to take questions if anybody wants to ask. Or I know it's a lot, but it says from the scope. That's a good question. The way it's worded, I guess it's going to be interesting to see. It's so vague that it might be hard to challenge. It'll be interesting to see. Questions? Anybody? Yeah. Yeah. Well,
is it a good representation, or is there one of the movies, one of the versions better than another?
No, well, I haven't seen them all. I've only seen the 1960 version.
That version?
Yeah. That one, it's not true to the historical fact of the trial. It's a dramatization of what was already extremely dramatic, but it makes it almost solely about the confrontation between Darrow and Bryan, which it sort of was about, but the ACLU is completely missing. Like, there's no ACLU, there's no town of Dayton. The town of Dayton is walking around looking to hang Darrow. They're like walking around, they're like a mob, and they're looking to hang Darrow. And so it's about McCarthyism, so they make it about mob rule. And so the town of Dayton looks terrible. Jennings Bryan looks terrible. It's a distortion of some sense of what actually happened. But it's a good movie, right? I mean, it's good drama, but it doesn't match what happened exactly. But other questions? Yeah.
Well, when you were looking at the data from students who went to a public school education and went to university, what kind of trends do you think you see for students who went to a private school and in college? Do you think they, like maybe some of their cognitive because they're in the religious school? Do you think that the line would increase in young people believing in Christianity?
This is a great question, and part of something that's it's problematic with my own analysis, because I only have data from one point in time, which is that we know as people get educated, especially in public schools, they're less likely to be literalists. So you may start as a literalist and decide, I'm actually, now I believe interpretation because I take classes in lit crit and history and all these kinds of things. So people may actually we know that education reduces that, so in doing that it will make acceptance of evolution more likely. But because I only have data from one point in time, I just find the people who made it to college and maintain their literalism. But we do know that as people move through education, they drop the literalist stance. They're more likely to. They certainly don't have to. So I think of I went to a talk from an ICR guy who came to ETSU last year, and he was an MD with a MPH from Harvard and well educated. So it's not about lack of education, you know what I mean? But follow up or?
Oh yeah, what trend do you think you'd see for students who go for political or private schools?
Well, it depends on the type of private school. Is it religious private? If it's religious private, you're going to find a lot of creationism because that is part of their curriculum. But you know, if it's a magnet school, it's about science and technology. You'll find evolution. So it kind of matters what type. But that's the thing is that the U.S. education system is really diverse. You have a lot of options, both higher ed and lower level. So it makes a big difference.
Do you have any predictions of where things will move with the internet kind of making the world a smaller place?
You know what? I honestly feel like it's probably going to be more of the same. I don't know if that's probably not a prediction that's very interesting, maybe, but because it's a political issue. It's not about like the evidence for evolution. It's a political issue, and so to the extent that it remains bound with other conservative, moral, political issues, I think it'll stay the same. As more people get college degrees, we should see literalism go down a little bit. We have seen that. So over time, you may see a little more acceptance, but I don't see it going away. I don't think it. Can it go away? I don't know that it can go away. You know what I mean? I feel like it's an issue of an interpretive community's moral position, and so they can maintain it. That's not a rosy picture.
Joseph, can you stay around for lunch?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
So we'll just go ahead and take a 20-minute break, and then we'll reconvene in here.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.